Hi Year 12s, and here is another video on evaluating different perspectives, attitudes and values represented in text by analysing the use of voice and narrative point of view, this time focusing on those who walk away from OMALAs. So a reminder that voice and narrative point of view are two different terms. Voice is a distinct personality discernible in a text, whereas the narrative point of view are the ways in which a narrator can be related to the story. For example, they might be first or third person, omniscient, or restricted in knowledge of events, so they might know everything or only know certain things. They can be reliable, trusted, or unreliable in interpreting what happens. Quick reminder of these terms. Feel free to pause if you have not watched the previous video or have forgotten. It is very important that you distinguish between the three different terms: perspectives, attitude, and value, and that will be judged in your answers. So if we're thinking about this text, the narrative point of view is really important. It's distinct, it's original, and really impacts the ideas created within the text. So it starts off sounding like a third person style of narration, but then it shifts to a first person and directly addressing the reader. It shifts from storytelling to thinking aloud and addressing the reader. The narrative style is unusual because it breaks the traditional barrier between the storyteller and the audience, drawing readers into creating the setting and the ethical dilemmas it presents. It seems omniscient. It knows far too much detail about some things that someone really shouldn't know, but then in other ways it's also uncertain. And the narrator uses a conditional tense, asks rhetorical questions, and inserts their own point of view into this world-building exercise. In this way, the narrative point of view creates a collaborative process of building the world of OMALAs. The reader becomes implicit. This means that if they create the world, have they also created the suffering of the child? And here are some quotes I've taken from YouTube which really show that particular narrative point of view. Not less complex than us. That use of the inclusive pronoun us really draws the reader into the discussion and the creation. Perhaps it would be best if you imagined it as your own fancy bits, assuming it will rise to the occasion, for certainly I cannot suit you all. This makes the world seem imagined as it is, created as the narrator goes along, and directly addresses the reader, you, encouraging them to help create it. They could perfectly well have central heating, subways, trains, washing machines. This interesting links to the context when it was written, if you think about America in the late 20th century. But we've also got the idea of the word could, this conditional phrase showing uncertainty. I thought at first there were no drugs, but that is puritanical. The narrator here is clearly indicating that this is a made-up place and she's changing the rules as she goes along. But as we did without clergy, let us do without soldiers. Again, a move back from that second person address to this inclusive first person, we and us. We, the reader, are building this world with the narrator. And then as the story goes on, so while the narrator was uncertain when they were describing OMALA's happiness, they do include a lot of detail when they're describing the child. They describe everything from the little light that seeps in dustily between cracks in the boards, secondhand from a cobweb window somewhere across the cellar. The idea of a cobweb window or the little light, the cracks, going down to the smallest detail in describing. They describe the sound of the child as it wails at night, and this vivid description, emotive description, horrific description of its buttocks and thighs are a mass of festered sores as it sits in its own excrement continually. Now this vivid and detailed description makes the child's suffering even more confronting. It gives the reader no way to avoid or ignore it, as they might in real life when considering those who suffer but they can't see directly in front of them. Now, while this narrative point of view doesn't provide any explicit judgment. It doesn't say one thing is wrong or one thing is right. These confronting images do help kind of imply a certain judgment. And there's also this judgment there in the description of different attitudes of the people of Omalas, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And near the end of this story, the point of view becomes even more uncertain, and perhaps this reflects the idea of the uncertainty of those who reject the society that they are in. These people go out into the street and walk down the street alone. They keep walking and walk straight out of the city of Omala. Through the beautiful gates, they keep walking across the farmlands of Omalas. Each one goes alone, youth or girl, man or woman. Notice as well that repetition of this word alone, and that often standing up against society can make you feel like you are alone. And of course, we don't need to just analyse narrative point of view, but also voice, so the distinct personality. So we might discuss how it starts with an intimate and conversational tone that engages the reader in the moral and philosophical questions at the story's heart. But the tone shifts throughout the story. Joyful and celebratory, but uncertain in the early parts of the story, to sombre and reflective when describing the child in the locked room, to mysterious and questioning when discussing those who walk away. These shifts in tone shift the reader's emotional response. Go back and have a look at the story and some of the quotes that I've given you for narrative point of view, and see if you can identify the language and syntax that have helped create these different tones. Here's a quick quote from a text of someone else who's offered an analysis of the story that says, in summary, the narrator in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omala is an omniscient yet conversational guide who blends philosophical reflection with vivid description. The role is not merely to tell the story, but to engage the reader in a deeper inquiry into the ethical questions the story raises. The narrator's openness, self-awareness, and direct address to the reader create a unique and thought-provoking narrative voice that compels the reader to participate in the moral dilemmas at the heart of Omala. So this syllabus point doesn't just ask us to analyse the use of narrative point of view or voice, but also then evaluate how they are used to represent perspectives, attitudes, and values. Remembering these are three very distinct terms. And I've identified some here for you. Feel free to pause and read through. Please note that with the perspective, I have clearly identified the context that shapes the way a person looks at the issue. And you will need to take these and then apply them in different questions. And I've given you a couple of statements here in the way that that might work. So, the emotional, uncertain voice of the narrator represents valuing the happiness of the many over the suffering of one as morally questionable. Notice I said questionable because it creates a thought experiment and literally encourages us to question the morality. And the use of a first-person narrative point of view that directly addresses the reader and involves them in a thought experiment supports the perspective of Ursula Le Guin, shaped by her context of living in America during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War, that we should question the systems and systematic suffering that support our happiness.